Stories of Grace and Faith. I'm your host, Chuck Groover. And last time we took a look at the life of John Newton, and today I figured I would take a look at the story behind what is probably his most well-known hymn. Faith's Review and Expectation, or as we better know today as Amazing Grace. The story we usually hear goes that John Newton was, or at least how I had heard it, was that John Newton was the captain of a slaving ship when it was suddenly caught up in a storm where the ship nearly sank, and he called out to God for mercy, and after surviving the storm, Newton then turned from the slave trade and wrote Amazing Grace. Although, if you listened to the last episode, you probably realize that that story I just mentioned was probably kind of almost what we would consider a Hollywood dramatization of the life of John Newton. Although there actually was a movie called Amazing Grace based on his life. I haven't seen it, but from what I've read, they actually followed more closely to the story of his life, rather than this taking the story of his life, cutting it up, and rearranging parts to make it sound even more spectacular. But with that being said, Amazing Grace actually has a more intricate story which came about from Newton's personal experience, but also a lot of what we attribute to Amazing Grace is more after the fact, which we'll kind of get to later on. Again, just kind of a recap of John Newton. He grew up without any particular religious conviction, though his life's path was set by a number of circumstances, often caused by the reaction of others due to what they considered a recalcitrant insubordination, which eventually led to him being on the ship that stormy night in 1748 where he had his conversion experience. The hymn was first published in 1779 within what was called the Olney Hymns, and that was basically a collaboration of hymns and poems written by John Newton and William Cowper. And it included a number of Newton's other at that time well-known hymns. These hymns were a collection that Newton and Cowper had used within services at Olney, where they had started basically a weekly prayer meeting to meet the needs of parishioners. And what they attempted to do at these prayer meetings was every meeting they actually attempted to present a poem or a hymn. And that's pretty much where these hymns and poems that created the Olney hymns came from, were these poems and hymns that they presented at the prayer meeting. Amazing Grace was actually written towards the end of 1772 and was probably first used to illustrate a sermon on New Year's Day of 1773, after which it pretty much settled into obscurity within England. But in the United States, however, Amazing Grace became popular among the Baptists and Methodists as a part of their evangelizing methods, and really gained popularity during the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. It was actually two men by the name of William Phipps and James Basker who actually interpreted the first stanza of Amazing Grace to be evidence of Newton's realization that his involvement in the slave trade was his wretchedness. However, when you look at Newton's life, he didn't really become an outspoken abolitionist until after he left Olney and after the Olney hymns were even published, which was close to 10 years after he actually wrote Amazing Grace. Because he didn't become an outspoken abolitionist until around 1780. And Newton himself is never known to have personally connected the writing of Amazing Grace to the anti-slavery movements that he became involved with later in life. A little background on the Olney hymns, which provides some background also into the story of Amazing Grace, is that they were actually arranged by association with biblical verses and actually did not address any political objective. Newton looked Amazing Grace pretty much came about as Newton looked at the start of the new year as a time to reflect on one's spiritual progress. And towards the end of 1772, he actually had finished, he put his last entry into a diary, and in that book, which has long since been lost, he actually reflected on the 17 years in which he had been keeping that diary. And the last entry actually recounted on how much he had changed over those 17 years. Again, remembering that these hymns were often associated with biblical verses, the verse that Amazing Grace was associated with was 1 Chronicles 17, verses 16 through 17, and actually focuses on David's reaction when the prophet Nathan informing David that even regardless of David's sins, that God was going to maintain David's family line forever. And the sermon that Newton presented that was associated with Amazing Grace was about the need to express gratitude for God's guidance, that God is involved in the lives of Christians even though they may not see it, and patience for deliverance from trials is warranted by the hope for the glory of eternity that awaits the believer. This was also, when you look at the sermon and the hymn, Cowper, who, if you remember, as I mentioned earlier, helped write some of the poems and hymns that comprised of the Olney hymns, he actually suffered from bouts of insanity and actually even attempted suicide several times. And Cowper himself may have been the person that Newton had in mind when he actually was preparing the hymn and sermon, employing themes of assurance and deliverance from despair for the benefit of his friend. Also, kind of as a side note, this was the last sermon that Newton preached in which Cowper heard in Olney, because shortly after the sermon was preached, Cowper's mental instability returned. Some more kind of background on just Amazing Grace in general is that has caused it to be so popular is the message that forgiveness and redemption are possible regardless of sins committed, and that the soul can be delivered from despair helped, again, make Amazing Grace one of the most recognizable songs in the English-speaking world, with estimates of the song itself being performed about 10 million times annually. The Dictionary of American Hymnology states that Amazing Grace is John Newton's, again, kind of where we get some of the story from. That states that Amazing Grace is Newton's spiritual autobiography in verse. But as mentioned, it probably has some to do with it, but that wasn't probably his primary focus. Also, scholar John Julian commented in the 1892 Dictionary of Hymnology, evidently a different publication, that outside of the United States, Amazing Grace was pretty much unknown and was actually far from being a good example of Newton's finest work. But I think some of where we get the, kind of going off notes here now, some of where we've gotten the association, besides of those two authors mentioned earlier that kind of pointed it out, with Amazing Grace, with Newton's involvement and involvement with, and then becoming with the slave trade, and then becoming an abolitionist. Some of it might be also because this, besides being popular among the Baptists and Methodists, Amazing Grace also was a popular hymn among the slaves in the U.S. So, again, this is CharlesGruver. That was Amazing Grace, and that's God at Work.